Today, understanding complex living systems is hard, but does it have to be? I'm Markus, I'm a biologist.
I'm Phil, I'm a statistician. Together, we discuss the best experiments to cut through biological complexity. Join us to explore the shape of the next experiment.
So Phil, you are both a scientist originally,
Right.
and now a statistical expert, although I'm sure that will make you cringe slightly for me to say it exactly in those terms, so that's why I said it in those terms. And I kind of thought we could kick off by sort of talking about what kind of interactions have you seen over the years between, scientists and statisticians, and where have they gone right, and what are the lurid stories for where they haven't gone right?
Yeah. So I think there are definitely examples from both of those. And I think one illustration, I think, that maybe covers both actually is there's a quote from famous statistician, really the originator of statistics, R.A. Fisher. So he worked at Rothamsted Agricultural Research Station near Luton Airport. And he was really the person that invented what we now know as design of experiments, or we might call multifactorial experimentation. And one of his most famous quotes is, "To consult the statistician after an experiment is finished is often merely to ask him to conduct a post-mortem examination. He can perhaps say what the experiment died of." So which I think is, it's a nice, funny quote.
It's true.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, it speaks to that. If you just leave scientists to experiment in the way that they've been told how to do it at high school or in university, or just leave them to use their natural instincts in experimentation, then often they don't collect good data.
Right.
Basically.
Right. But you could also have that sort of said in a slightly more condescending way, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's the other thing, is it's a bit of a sneery, kind of smug, self-satisfied way of saying things.
Yeah.
And I have come across people in my time working in these industries of people who use it in that way. And, you do occasionally come across statisticians who I would describe as being gatekeepers, who take a lot of pleasure in telling people when they're doing things wrong.
Right.
And instead of being necessarily part of the solution, they're just there to kind of tell people when they're part of the problem.
Right.
So I think that's a real shame. I was going to reflect on another famous statistician, to talk about maybe the more positive ways that statisticians can work with scientists,
right,
can work with biologists. So I've recently been reading the memoirs of George Box. So he was a statistician who worked with Fisher at Porton Down during the Second World War, so learned from Fisher. And one of the big things that comes out from his book, from these memoirs, is he feels very strongly that the power of statistics and real innovation in how we do statistics and how we do science comes from statisticians working on the application, the real problems from industry.
Right. Yeah, and we were talking just before this about the fact that there seems to be like that kind of bifurcation maybe between, the ones who'll say, Fisher's quote in a sneery kind of way, and those who actually just want to get stuck in and try and affect how biology might be done. And I think, from the biologist perspective as well, there has to be a sense of openness and curiosity. And in my case, there's got a lot of frustration about the fact that actually it feels like we should be able to be doing things a lot better. And I think that the best interactions we've had over the years have been those which very much where you're bridging the gap, right, between and you have open-mindedness on both sides, the willingness to spend time to actually learn each other's languages and to really understand where each other are coming from. And I've got a fun example of that from early days in Synthace, when we were looking to do, high-dimensional experiments from the outset. And we were doing things which I think, your sneery statistician would have, choked over his or her beer, right? And because, there's this kind of thing in statistics that if you're going to do a lot of experimental runs, then you need to randomize the order in which you're doing those runs, and so you even out the effect of any kind of random noise that you might be getting across a particular set. And we just didn't do that at all.
Ooh.
Yeah, it's terrible, right? But it's because, like, when you know about actually how you're setting up that experiment, I mean, so we were setting these up in multi-well plates, and we know as biologists that the edge is a dangerous place, the corners are particularly dangerous, right? So just don't put runs there, right? And if you put like water in those places instead, and you put your runs in the middle, then you've accounted for the biggest source of variance, systematic variance that you might have across a plate. And so then you don't actually have to randomize your run order. You can make the very knowing assumption that actually that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
And the statistician could go spit out their beer and it's and it's fine. But that only came about because we had a really good interaction between those folks who actually understand what they're talking about in terms of stats. So particularly Michael Sadowski within Synthace, having that good pragmatic conversation about what's possible and what isn't possible.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that really is where we need to try and find that kind of sweet spot, because all of a sudden then you can do super cool experiments and you can cut through biological complexity like you couldn't before.
Mm-hmm.
But while there's that barrier, and we don't understand each other, where each other's coming from, and maybe there's a sense of overly statistical purity on the other side and overly biological conservatism
Mm-hmm.
on the other side, then I don't think we're going to make our way forward, right?
Yeah. So I wonder, it's just occurred to me. So what do you think was unique about the environment that you and Sid were working in that enabled you to do that? Because I think a lot of people, they don't have the confidence to do this themselves, and like I say, if they're supported by some statistician who's all about the purity of Fisher's principles of replication and randomization, then they could easily get put off and be told, no, you're doing these things wrong. So what was it that enabled you and Sid to kind of make that leap?
Well, obviously we're remarkably special people, but beyond that, I think we just had a shared mission, right? And it was something a bit more meta, right? Because often as scientists, particularly in industrial settings or whatever, then it's just about get a result as quickly as you can, get this thing over the line as quickly as you can. But this was in the environment of a startup of Synthace. And from the outset, we were looking at not just the question of how we could get that specific result, but how could we get results better in general. It's that idea of the science of how you do science.
Yeah.
And that was always something that fascinated us and something that drew us together in the first place. And I think actually it's something that kind of draws a lot of people into these conversations, and why you might give up your Thursday to come and chat with a load of fellow nerds.
Yeah.
I think that there is a growing sense in biology of frustration, and that we can actually do things better. And I think that's super exciting.
Yeah.
And I think it's our job then to try and bridge that gap as best as we possibly can, show what's possible, still listen to the statisticians, right?
Yeah.
But then work out, where with each step about how we can continually do things better.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. It makes me think, again, I'm always going back to these kind of historical examples, but George Box used to have, similar to what we're doing here, he used to have these Monday night beer
Nice.
sessions. Yeah.
I'm liking this guy more and more.
Yeah. So he'd invite students and other professors from University of Madison, Wisconsin, round to his house on a Monday evening, and they'd have a box of beer, and they'd talk about their real world problems, their real industrial problems that they were tackling. They'd bring in chemical engineers from the local chemical company or whatever. So I think we need more of that kind of thing, right? We need more of George Box's attitude to collaboration and to being affirming, being like enabling and empowering of science, rather than maybe the sneery kind of R.A. Fisher way of looking at it.